The logging trucks came before the town woke up. That was the thing nobody mentioned. Not Calhoun Dewey next door, not the county clerk who'd sent the property tax notice to an address in Little Rock that no longer existed, not the lawyer Idella had spoken to briefly on the phone the week before she signed the papers. Nobody mentioned the trucks because nobody was awake to see them, and the ones who were awake had long since decided the empty Whitaker place wasn't their business. The gate had been broken since her father's funeral. 11 years of broken gate, 11 years of gravel road leading to 60 acres that belonged on paper, to a woman who hadn't set foot on it since they lowered Earl Whitaker into the ground on a Tuesday in October. Idella Marsh arrived on a Wednesday in March of 2013, just ahead of a cold front that smelled like rain and old iron, with everything she'd kept from 19 years of marriage loaded into the back of a 12-year-old Subaru she'd bought herself in 2001 with money from a job she no longer had. The house sat at the end of a quarter-mile dirt track off County Road 14, 2 miles outside a town called Calder, Arkansas, which had a feed store, a diner that closed at 2 in the afternoon, a single traffic light that blinked yellow after dark. The porch roof on the east side had collapsed sometime in the last decade, pulling a section of gutter with it. The front door stuck in its frame. 3 windows on the north face had been covered from inside with plastic sheeting, gray translucent, the kind that said nobody who lived here had planned to stay. She stood in the dirt in front of that house for a long moment, the car engine ticking as it cooled the wind, moving through the bare hardwoods at the edge of the property with a sound like something being carefully torn. Then she picked up the box closest to her books, a cast iron skillet she'd bought at a tag sale in 1998, and carried it inside. The kitchen still smelled like her father. Cedar coffee grounds a trace of the pipe tobacco he'd quit the year before he died, so faint now it might have been memory rather than molecule. She set the box on the counter and stood with her hand flat on the linoleum, the same yellow and white pattern from when she was 7 years old, worn through to the backing near the stove. Her father had stood in that spot every morning of his life on this land. The floor had recorded it the way wood records everything quietly, completely without complaint. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried through any of it, not through the conference table and the 2 lawyers in the columns dividing 19 years into before and after. Not when the movers came for the furniture she was leaving behind. Not when Garrett stood in the doorway of the kitchen they'd renovated twice and watched them carry out the table with the scratch on the leaf where someone's dog had gotten at it decades before they owned it. She'd always meant to fix that scratch. She never did. She filled the kettle with water from the tap that ran orange for 30 seconds before it cleared. She waited for something to boil. The first truck came the next morning. She heard it before she saw it, a diesel rumble arriving from the east, while the fog still sat low over the back pasture, while the light was still the color of old pewter. She'd been awake since 5, sitting on the back step, with instant coffee in a mug from her father's cabinet, reading a water-stained property survey she'd found in the desk in the back bedroom. The survey showed 60 acres in clean black lines, the back 40 shaded to indicate timber. The boundary with the neighboring property running along a creek she remembered fishing as a girl. She heard the truck, then a second one. By the time she walked out to the edge of the back pasture, the fog had thinned enough to see them 2 flatbed logging trucks backed up to the tree line, 200 yards past the old fence, their hydraulics groaning, their beds tilting. The sound that followed was the earth being struck with something enormous, impact after impact, each one sending a shudder through the ground she felt through the soles of her shoes. The trucks finished in less than 10 minutes. They pulled out without stopping, without glancing toward the house, without any indication that they understood they were on someone's property. The stumps were everywhere. Oak stumps the size of kitchen tables. Maple stumps still weeping sap that caught the thin morning light and turned it amber. A black walnut stump so wide she could have laid down across it without touching both edges, its root system still gripping clumps of red Ozark clay, like a fist refusing to release something held for 100 years. Sawdust clung to the wet grass and drifts gold against the green. The smell of cut wood and diesel hadn't fully cleared, hanging in the cold air like a sentence that hadn't finished being spoken. She stood at the edge of it for a long time. Most people call the lawyer. She called the tape measure. It wasn't in the house. She had to unpack 4 boxes before she found it. The same Stanley tape measure she'd used for 15 years, the one with a sticky note on the back reading, garage in her own handwriting from a move that hadn't happened yet. She walked back out into the pasture with the tape measure and a spiral notebook from the desk drawer, and she started with the biggest stump. The walnut, 4 feet and 3 inches across. She crouched beside it and placed her palm flat on the cut surface, feeling the rings under her skin tight near the outer edge. Then a section in the middle where they widened slightly. Years when the water table had been high or the summers generous. Then tight again toward the center where the tree had been young and the world had been harder. She counted under her breath. She got to 67, lost her place, started again. 72, give or take. 72 years of rings in a stump sitting in an Ozark field because someone had decided this was a convenient place to leave it. She wrote in the notebook WN1, 4 feet 3 inches diameter, estimated 72 years, root intact, grain visible, figured possibly curly at base, check moisture when equipment available. She moved to the next one. She was on her 14th stump when she heard boots on the gravel at the fence line and looked up to find a man watching her from the other side of the rusted wire. Broad through the shoulders, somewhere past 70, wearing canvas coveralls and a John Deere cap, washed so many times the logo had gone soft. He had the kind of face that came from decades of outdoor work, not weathered in the dramatic way people described in books, but simply used the way tools get used, the way anything gets used that does its job for a long time without complaint. Calhoun Dewey had farmed the adjoining property since before Idella was born. He'd known her father for 40 years, attended the funeral, kept a quiet eye on the empty Whitaker place ever since, in the way that Ozark neighbors kept eyes on things, not intrusively, not with announcement, just present in the way that mattered when it needed to. He looked at her notebook. He looked at the tape measure. He looked at the field of stumps, then back at her, and his expression did something complicated that ended somewhere between assessment and reluctant respect. The logging company was called Drummond Timber, he told her. They'd been harvesting a large tract 2 properties over for the better part of 8 years. Somewhere around year 3, when disposal fees at the county site started adding up, one of the crew noticed the Whitaker gate was broken and the field was empty. Nobody had ever said a word. So they started leaving stumps, a few loads a season, at first tucked near the tree line. Then more. Then every week regular as mail. Figured somebody'd eventually say something. Calhoun said, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man delivering news he'd expected someone to deliver before now. Nobody ever did. Idella looked out over the field. She tried to count the stumps from where she stood and gave up somewhere past 150. She thanked Calhoun. She went inside. She called Vivian Pruitt, who had an office in Fayetteville, and a reputation according to the woman who'd recommended her for not losing things she should have won. Vivian Pruitt had silver hair cut short, reading glasses on a beaded chain, the manner of a woman who had spent 30 years in a profession that rewarded precision and patience in roughly equal measure. She listened to Idella describe the situation without interrupting, asked 4 questions, sat back. Trespass, she said. Illegal dumping. Years of unauthorized use of private property. A settlement or a court order could be substantial. What happens to the stumps if I win? Idella asked. Vivian looked up from her legal pad. They'll be required to remove everyone. Full cleanup, all at Drummond's cost. Idella nodded slowly. She said she'd think about it. She drove back to Calder that evening on Highway 412 through 30 miles of cleared timberland, the sun going down orange behind the ridge to her left. She thought about what a field looked like after a cleanup crew took away everything that had been left behind. She thought about the walnut stump with its 72 rings and the figured grain at the base. She thought about the maple stumps still weeping sap and the cherry stumps near the old fence line and the smell of cut wood in the cold morning fog that had, for a moment she wasn't ready to examine closely, smelled like her father's shop. What if they're worth more here than gone? It wasn't a plan, barely a thought, more like a question that arrived from somewhere she hadn't been looking and refused to leave. She pulled off at a gravel turnout and sat with the engine idling and the question sitting in the car with her like a passenger she hadn't invited. She didn't call Vivian back that week. She didn't call her back the week after. What she did instead was drive to the public library in Calder on a Thursday afternoon and sit at one of 2 desktop computers available for public use. Her cell phone called and texted, and did little else. The farmhouse had no internet yet. She read for 3 hours the first day, came back Saturday, and read for 4 more. She found forums where woodworkers argued about species characteristics with the intensity of men arguing about baseball. She found a USDA Forest Service publication on hardwood properties that contained buried in its tables more practical information than anything written for a general audience. She found a retired cabinet maker in Vermont who had written in a series of long and meandering blog posts the clearest explanation she'd encountered of why green wood fails when you work it before it's ready. Wood isn't a material, he'd written in one post in a sentence she copied into her notebook. Wood is a process. It's still doing what it was doing when it was alive. Your job isn't to stop it. Your job is to work with what it's becoming. She learned that walnut deepened into chocolate brown with violet undertones when finished with oil, that the color in raw walnut was not the color the wood became, that finishing revealed something the raw surface concealed. She learned that cherry darkened dramatically with UV exposure, that a piece would look entirely different at 5 years than at 5 weeks. She learned that figured maple hid its best qualities until sliced thin and held to the light. She learned what checking meant, the way wood splits along the grain as it releases moisture, a process that happens in every piece of green wood and cannot be stopped, only managed. She learned that the standard rule for air drying was 1 year per inch of thickness, which meant the big walnut stump would need years before it was stable enough to work without catastrophic splitting. Years. She sat with that. Then she wrote in her notebook, "Start now. Work the ready ones first." The moisture meter cost $62 at the farm supply in Calder, more than she wanted to spend given that the property tax was due in August, and her monthly budget had contracted sharply since January. She bought it anyway. She walked the field with it in her hand, pressing probes into the cut surfaces of stumps she'd cataloged, reading numbers in the 40s and 50s for the freshly cut ones, lower 20s for a few older stumps near the back of the field that had been sitting long enough to lose some surface moisture. Below 19% was the threshold. Most of what she had was nowhere near ready, but not all of it. Near the old fence line, she found a cluster of stumps grayer than the rest, older deliveries left before the recent arrivals covered them over. A cherry stump about 20 inches across, 2 oaks between 14 and 18 inches, a small maple she almost passed until she crouched beside it and saw the faint shimmer in the grain she'd read about, but hadn't expected to recognize on sight the watered silk appearance of figured maple barely visible in the cloudy afternoon light waiting. She pressed the probes into the cherry stump. 22%. Close, not ready, but close. She marked these with orange surveyor ribbon from the barn, tying a strip to each one. She was managing inventory she understood, rather than looking at a field full of someone else's problem. Calhoun came by that afternoon while she was tying the last ribbon. He stood at the fence in his canvas coveralls and watched without asking anything. That quality of his watching she would come to value over the months ahead, the way he could be present without filling the air. He'd left something on the fence post before he went back to his truck, a paper bag, which turned out to hold a mason jar of apple butter and a sleeve of crackers. She ate on the back step that evening as the light went out of the sky, apple butter on her fingers, watching the field go dark, thinking about the cherry stump and its 22% reading and what it might look like when it was finally ready. She borrowed the chainsaw from Calhoun on a Saturday in late April. She'd watched 3 tutorial videos on the library computer, read 2 articles on chainsaw technique for beginners, identified what looked to her like a promising oak stump 18 inches across, one of the older ones. Moisture reading around 24%, which she'd persuaded herself was close enough. She had a rough plan, hollow the top into a planter shape. The videos had made it look manageable. She had sneakers on. She didn't own appropriate work gloves. She was carrying the chainsaw toward the field when Calhoun's truck turned into the drive, and he pulled up and got out and looked at her, at the sneakers, at the bare hands, at the angle of the chainsaw bar, and he didn't say anything. He went to his truck bed. He came back with a pair of cut-resistant chaps that had been her father's, still on their storage hook, that Calhoun had found in the barn at some point and kept without explaining why. He laid them over the fence rail. He went back and returned with work gloves, safety glasses, a can of bar oil. He set these beside the chaps. He looked at her once more. Then he got in his truck and drove back down the road to his own property. She stood in the April morning with her father's chaps draped over the fence rail and understood that something had been communicated to her without a single word. She put on the chaps, the gloves, the glasses. She oiled the bar. Then she spent 6 hours turning a perfectly good 18-inch oak stump into what she later described to no one as what a stump looks like after it's been attacked by something confused and angry. The bar chain bound 3 times, jamming so badly the third time she had to call Calhoun to help free it. The wood splintered instead of cutting clean. By the end of the afternoon, her right shoulder ached from fighting the tool rather than guiding it. Her hands were blistered through the gloves. The stump was ruined, not imperfect, but genuinely, irretrievably ruined. She sat on the ground beside it as the light changed. She thought about 19 years of a life that had also been ruined in a way no finishing would salvage. She was surprised to find that the comparison didn't make her feel worse. It made her feel something more like clarity. You start over. That was the only move. The second failure came 3 weeks later and hurt more because she'd been more careful. She'd selected a maple stump from the older cluster near the fence line, checked its moisture reading every 2 days for a week, 26 to 24 to 23, before deciding close enough. She roughed out a simple flat-topped form, worked slowly, stopped to rest her shoulder. When she finished, she sealed the cut surfaces with exterior polyurethane, 2 coats the way the can instructed. 3 weeks later, on a warm Thursday morning, she heard a sound from the back pasture she felt in her chest before she understood it. A crack, not dramatic, not like a gunshot, but loud enough to carry 200 yards, and through a window she'd left cracked an inch. She walked out to the lean-to shelter she'd built from salvaged lumber at the field's edge. The maple had split cleanly down the center, the 2 halves separated by a gap she could fit 3 fingers into. The split running from top to ground as precisely as if someone had planned it. 3 weeks of work. She stood in the lean-to with her hands at her sides. She thought about quitting, not dramatically, just quietly, the way rational thoughts arrive when the evidence has stacked high enough. She had no relevant skills, no mentor, no capital to absorb more failed experiments. She almost called Vivian Pruitt that afternoon. She went as far as picking up the phone. She didn't dial. She drove to the library instead and spent 2 hours reading about spalted wood, the dark, irregular patterns she'd noticed in one of the older walnut stumps, which she'd assumed was rot, but which turned out to be something different entirely. Spalting was fungal growth in the early stages of wood decomposition, and when caught at the right moment after the fungus had created its patterns. Before it structurally weakened the wood, it produced coloring worth considerably more on the custom furniture market than plain-grained wood of the same species. Spalted maple tabletops selling for $3,000 and $4,000. A bowl turner in North Carolina who wrote about identifying spalting potential in the field by feel and smell and a kind of intuition he admitted he couldn't fully explain. She wrote in her notebook, the things that look like damage are sometimes the most valuable part. She wasn't certain she was writing about wood. It was Calhoun who mentioned Harlan Spire. He'd stopped by on a June morning with a bag of early tomatoes from his garden. Cherokee purples, her father's favorite. A detail she suspected Calhoun knew precisely, and he'd asked with the careful indirection of a man who has been thinking about something for a while, whether she'd heard of the fellow who used to do all the carved woodwork for the state park system. The trail markers, the carved animals, the signage at the Ozark National Forest trailheads. Probably wouldn't be interested in visitors, Calhoun added. Then he put the tomatoes on the fence post and drove away. She drove out to Ridgeline Road the following Saturday with a photograph of the ruined oak stump. She found a house set back behind 2 enormous white oaks, a property that looked tended, the way only someone who truly understood wood could tend it. Nothing wasted, everything purposeful. Cut logs stacked under a metal-roofed lean-to, sorted by species and size the way a library arranges books. The man who answered the door was somewhere in his late 60s, rangy with hands that looked made specifically for the work they'd done for 3 decades. He looked at her. He looked at the photograph she held out. He took it. He studied it for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at her hands, at the blisters still healing on her palms, the cut on her right index finger from the bar chain, the callus forming on the heel of her right hand. "You cut this wet," he said. Not a question. "I didn't know," she said. "Most don't." He handed the photograph back. He looked at her a moment more, and then he said, "Wood isn't ruined because it's old. It's ruined when people stop imagining." He went inside. He closed the door. She stood on the porch with the photograph and the white oaks moving in the June wind above her, and no way to know whether what had just happened was a beginning or an ending. She drove back to Calder with the windows down and made a decision she wouldn't frame as a decision until much later. She would treat that conversation as enough. She'd been given something. She wasn't going to spend time worrying about whether it was what she'd hoped for. The summer passed in preparation. She had enough money barely to keep the utilities on, and the tax covered. If she didn't spend anything, she didn't have to. She built a second lean-to at the edge of the field, larger than the first, with a corrugated metal roof salvaged from an outbuilding her father had let go to ruin. She acquired a used chainsaw from a man in Calder who'd bought it for a tree project and hadn't touched it since, and she practiced on wood she knew was already compromised, learning to let the tool work rather than forcing it. She tagged every stump in the backfield orange for ready, blue for needs. Another season, red for set aside, which covered mostly the stumps with unusual grain or visible spalting. She wasn't ready to risk until she understood them better. She built a moisture tracking log in the notebook, a grid with stump numbers across the top, and dates down the side, the kind of record-keeping she'd done for 15 years in an office. The discipline was the same. The subject matter was different. Harlan's Spire appeared at her fence line for the first time in late July. She didn't see him arrive. She was crouched beside a walnut stump, scoring the bark with a handsaw, in a pattern she'd developed from reading about a technique used by timber framers to manage checking in large-diameter logs when she became aware of being watched. She stood, turned, found him at the fence, hands resting on the top wire, watching with an expression she still couldn't read. He watched her work for 10 minutes without speaking. She kept working horizontal score rings at 6-inch intervals, vertical relief cuts between them, a pattern designed to give the wood somewhere to go when it moved, rather than letting it choose its own path. "Let it split where it wants to," he said, "or teach it where." He walked back to his truck and drove away. She stood with the handsaw in her hand, turning those 11 words over in her mind, looking at the score lines she'd cut and the ones she hadn't. It took her a week of looking to understand. The horizontal rings managed moisture release. The vertical cuts directed the inevitable check. Together, they weren't preventing the wood from doing what it was going to do. They were teaching it which direction to do it in. She went back out that evening and adjusted the remaining lines. By August, she had 43 stumps tagged orange drying under 2 lean-tos and a third structure built from salvaged greenhouse panels. Her moisture log had entries for 61 individual stumps. The back pasture, which had looked in March like a field of garbage, looked in August like a working inventory organized, track tended. She didn't have a product. She didn't have a customer. She had a field of wood that was slowly at the pace wood set for itself, and no faster becoming something she could work with. On the last evening of August, a Wednesday, she sat on the back step with instant coffee, going cold in her father's mug, and looked out over the field in the last light. The lean-tos cast long shadows. The surveyor ribbons on the stumps, orange, blue, red, caught the light and moved in the small evening wind. Somewhere in the tree line, a barred owl called once. She thought about Garrett briefly, the way you think about a place you used to live. Not with longing, not with bitterness, but with the particular recognition that it was real, and it was over, and it had taken you somewhere that led eventually to here. She thought about the scratch on the table leaf. She thought about what the Vermont cabinet maker had written about wood being a process rather than a material. She thought about walnut that deepens when you finish it, cherry that darkens with light, figured maple that hides its best qualities until you know where to look. She went inside and wrote in her notebook until the light was gone. The trucks came again the following Thursday. The cherry stump split the way she'd hoped it would, which was to say it split where she told it to. February of 2014, a Tuesday morning with ice still on the grass and the sky the color of old pewter. Idella stood in the lean-to with her breath making small clouds and looked at what the winter had done, what she had done working with the winter rather than against it. The score lines she'd cut back in October had guided the inevitable check along 2 clean vertical planes, opening the stump like a book rather than shattering it the way greenwood shattered when it had nowhere to go but everywhere at once. The interior grain was visible now, the reddish brown of properly dried cherry, tighter than she'd expected, with a faint shimmer near the base that might have been nothing or might have been the beginning of something worth keeping. She pressed the moisture meter probes into the interior surface. 16%. Ready. She didn't reach for the chainsaw immediately. She stood for a while longer with her hand on the exposed grain, reading it the way she'd spent the winter learning to read. Not for what she wanted it to be, but for what it was telling her it could become. The split had created a natural hollow near the base, deeper on the left side than the right, angled in a way she hadn't planned, but which suggested, if she worked with it, a planting depression that would hold soil without modification. The outer bark was still intact on the curved sides. The root system at the base had dried into a splayed form that would keep the piece stable on uneven ground without any additional work. She thought briefly of the maple stump she'd rushed in May, the crack she'd heard from the porch, the 3 weeks of work undone in one morning. The cherry had been sitting in the same field through the same winter. The difference between them was time she'd been willing to give. The chainsaw work that morning took 4 hours instead of 6, and for the first time the bar didn't bind. She'd learned over the winter to read the resistance in the tool before it became a problem. A slight increase in engine pitch, a subtle change in how the saw tracked signals that arrived a half-second before trouble in greenwood, but which in properly dried cherry meant the grain was shifting direction and she needed to adjust her angle. The interior cuts were cleaner than anything she'd made in April. Not perfect, the walls of the hollow were uneven in places. There was a spot near the rim where she'd hesitated, and the saw had wandered but clean enough to work with. She set the chainsaw down, ran her hand along the interior walls, felt what was there, the possibility of something. Harlan appeared at the fence that afternoon without warning. The way she'd stopped being startled by over the months since their first encounter on his ridgeline road porch. Canvas jacket against the February cold, hands in his pockets. He looked at the cherry stump under the lean-to for a long moment, then crossed to the fence and looked closer at the split planes, the score lines from October, the hollow she'd roughed out that morning. He picked up a handful of cherry shavings from the ground and rubbed them between his palms, smelling the sawdust. Set them down. A crack isn't a flaw, he said. It's where the wood decided to be honest. He walked back to his truck. She spent 10 minutes after he left standing with that sentence, looking at the natural split lines in the cherry stump, the ones she'd guided but hadn't created the places where the wood's own internal stress had found its resolution. She'd been thinking of them as something to manage. Harlan had suggested they were something to reveal. The distance between those two framings was larger than it looked from the outside. She got the angle grinder from the barn. She'd bought it secondhand in November from the same man who'd sold her the chainsaw, on the theory that it would smooth rough chainsaw texture into something a customer would actually want to touch. She'd practiced on scrap pieces through the winter, learning that pressure and angle mattered as much with the grinder as with the saw. Too much pressure in one spot created a depression. The eye found immediately, even when the hand couldn't feel it. The grain direction changed in hardwood in ways requiring constant adjustment. By February, she was competent, not yet good. She worked the interior of the cherry hollow for 2 hours, stopping to run her palm across the surface. After every few passes, reading the grain with her fingers, the way she'd learned to read it with her eyes. She worked the rim until the transition between rough exterior bark and finished interior felt intentional rather than abrupt. She left a section of the split face unsmoothed, the natural check plane visible as a seam in the wood surface, and wondered whether that was artistic judgment or laziness, then decided she'd figure out which it was later. The epoxy came next. Natural cracks in hardwood stump work were not flaws to conceal. Harlan had confirmed what she'd been moving toward, but neither could they be left open. Deep cracks collected water which froze in an Ozark winter and split a piece catastrophically the way the maple had split in May. The solution she'd found in 3 different woodworking forms, in one academic paper on timber preservation, was 2-part clear epoxy poured into the void and allowed to cure, producing a fill structurally superior to the wood around it, completely waterproof, transparent enough that the grain remained visible at depth. She'd ordered the epoxy in November, practiced the pour on scrap pieces through December and January, learning the viscosity. The working time before curing began the way air bubbles had to be coaxed to the surface with a heat gun rather than left to cloud the fill. She'd ruined 4 practice pieces. She'd learned something from each one. The cherry stump had 1 deep natural crack running from the rim down the interior wall and 2 smaller surface checks on the exterior. She mixed the epoxy, carefully poured slowly, watched it find its level, tapped the side of the stump to encourage the air to rise, coaxed the bubbles with the heat gun in slow passes, poured a second time after the first layer settled. Then she left it alone. She did not come back to check it every hour. That had been another lesson from the winter: do the work correctly, then let the wood do its part. Checking too often was a form of impatience, and impatience was how you ruined things that were almost ready. She came back the following morning. The epoxy had cured clear the crack, now a seam of glass through which the cherry grain was visible at depth, as if the flaw had been turned into a window. She ran her thumbnail across it, hard, smooth, level with the surrounding wood. 3 coats of sealer followed, sanding lightly between the first and second. She contacted 2 different woodworking supply companies in January and asked specifically for a recommendation for hardwood outdoor sealer in a Zone 6 climate with significant freeze-thaw cycling. Both had recommended the same product. The smell of it filled the lean-to and drifted out into the February cold, sharp against the clean winter air. When the 3rd coat dried, she carried the cherry stump to the back step and set it in the afternoon light and looked at it for a long time. It wasn't beautiful in the way finished furniture was beautiful. The walls of the hollow were still uneven in places, the rims still showed the hesitation mark from where the saw had wandered. But the epoxy seam caught the light and held it. The interior grain had deepened with the sealer into a reddish brown that made you want to touch it. The unsmooth split face looked like a decision rather than an accident. The first time she understood she had made something, it wasn't a dramatic moment. A cherry stump on a back step in February light. A woman looking at it. The quiet understanding that the months had not been wasted. Green wood cut too soon splits itself apart. So do people. She wrote that in her notebook that evening, not wisdom she'd been given, but something she'd watched happen over 11 months in a field in the Arkansas Ozarks, arrived through observation rather than instruction. She'd been trying to force things that weren't ready. The oak stump in April, the maple in May. The version of herself that had sat across from Vivian Pruitt and not yet understood that what felt like legal leverage was actually just weight. You let things dry first. You let the internal pressure equalize. Then you work with what they've become. Spring came in stages, the way Ozark springs came. A week of warmth, a hard frost, then warmth again. The red buds blooming and getting caught by a late freeze, and blooming again with the stubbornness of things that had been doing this longer than anyone watching. By April, she had worked 5 more stumps from the ready inventory. 2 oak, 2 maple, 1 small walnut she'd nearly set aside as too young, but which had a grain so tight it took the finish like glass. She lined them up under the lean-to in order of completion and looked at them, and the line of finished pieces told her something the individual pieces hadn't. She was developing a sensibility. Not a style exactly. A set of principles she couldn't yet fully articulate. Let the wood show its history, fill the cracks rather than hiding them. Leave the exterior rough and make the interior earned. A neighbor named Florence Pickett stopped by in late April. She lived half a mile down County Road 14, had known Idela's father had sent a dish of food over in March that Idela had returned with a handwritten note. Florence was in her 70s, drove a truck, older than some marriages, had a front porch holding 11 different potted plants arranged with the care of someone who paid attention to such things. She'd stopped to ask whether the access road to the creek was still passable. She'd been fishing that creek since she was a girl, and on her way past, she saw the oak planter under the lean-to and stopped walking. She looked at it for a moment. "What would you take for that?" she asked. Idela said yes before she thought of a number, then said $40, then drove home from depositing the check, feeling the particular elation of a thing that is objectively too small for the emotion it produces. $40 covered her gas for the week and her bar oil and nothing else. The math was not good. The math did not matter in that moment in any way she could explain rationally. Florence Pickett's oak planter sat on the corner of her front porch, where it could be seen from County Road 14, and Florence told people where it came from, the way certain people tell everyone about something they're pleased with freely, often without being asked. By the first week of May, Idela's cell phone was ringing with calls from people she didn't know. A woman in Calder wanted 2 of the maple pieces for her back patio. A man from the next county over had seen the planter while helping Florence with a fence post and wanted something similar for his wife's garden, bigger if possible. She said yes to all of it. The summer of 2014 was a tutorial she was paying for with her own errors. She learned to fill deep cracks with clear epoxy across all her pieces, rather than guessing which voids needed addressing. She learned that certain customers needed to be told explicitly that outdoor wood furniture required maintenance, that a properly sealed piece would last decades, but the sealer needed checking every 2 seasons and refreshing every 4. And customers who understood this from the beginning came back rather than blamed the piece for their own neglect. She learned which sealers held through an Ozark winter after road testing her earlier samples through the previous cold season. The first sealer she'd used had failed by March, clouding at the edges, and she'd had to refinish 2 pieces at no charge. She learned about wood burning in August, when she scorched a piece by accident, held the angle grinder's flap disc too long in one spot, then held the piece in afternoon light, and saw that the darkening had done something to the grain she hadn't anticipated. She spent a week experimenting deliberately with a small burning tool ordered from a woodworking supply in Missouri, learning to darken the proud grain lines of oak and walnut while leaving the softer tissue between them untouched, which produced a definition the unburned pieces lacked. She burned a sample panel of 4 different species and pinned it to the lean-to wall as reference. Harlan came by twice that summer. The first time he looked at the burning sample panel for a long time without commenting, then picked up a piece of scrap walnut and ran his thumbnail across the grain in a specific pattern, reading the difference in hardness between the growth rings, the information contained in texture that the eye couldn't see. He put the scrap down and walked back to the fence. The second time in September, he watched her work for nearly 20 minutes longer than usual. He came through the fence gate, something he'd never done before, and stood beside her and took the angle grinder from her hands. He showed her once how he held it wrist loose, pressure coming from the tool's own weight rather than from his arm, the angle constant through a tension rather than muscle tension. He handed it back. He went through the gate and walked to his truck. She held the grinder the way he'd shown her and worked for another hour, and afterward her shoulder didn't ache. The coffee shop commission came in October from a woman named Bev Alderman, who ran a place called Current Ground in downtown Calder. Bev wanted 6 stump stools for the patio she was building on the east side. Stumps between 16 and 20 inches in height, finished for outdoor use, as close as possible in diameter and grain character. Matching was the part that gave Idella pause. She'd never thought about her pieces in relation to each other as a set. She walked the field for 2 afternoons before she found 6 stumps that satisfied her, all oak within a 2-inch range of diameter, all showing the tight grain character of properly dried white oak she'd come to recognize as the most reliable material for pieces needing to hold shape through years of outdoor use. She seasoned them through the fall, worked them through November, delivered them on a cold December morning in the bed of a pickup truck she'd bought in October with money that was finally beginning to accumulate. Bev photographed the stools before she opened that day and posted the images to the coffee shop's accounts. By the end of the week, Idella's phone had rung 4 times with people asking about custom work from towns 2 counties over. The scale of things was changing. Spring of 2015 arrived, wet, the kind of Ozark spring that turned creek bottoms to mud and roads into decisions about which truck you trusted. The field behind the farmhouse had by then a quality she hadn't anticipated when she'd started cataloging Stumps 2 years before it felt managed. The lean-to shelters held finished inventory and drying stock in separate sections. Her moisture log had grown to 3 notebooks. The back corner of the field held only 4 stumps, now all red-tagged, 2 spalted walnut. She was waiting to feel ready for 1 figured cherry with grains so unusual she wanted to be better before she touched it. 1 with no tag at all, the big walnut, the first one she'd measured in the March fog 2 years ago. 72 rings, root system still intact. She'd moved it once to a spot near the back of the main lean-to where it was sheltered from direct rain. That was the extent of her plans for it. Loretta Vance called on a Wednesday in April. Idella almost didn't answer. She was midway through a sealer application and had let 2 calls go to voicemail that week. Something about the timing made her set down the brush. She answered. Loretta Vance was a widow from a town called Heber's Ford, 20 miles east along the river valley. Her husband, Harold, had died 14 months before. Her daughter had seen a photograph of the coffee shop stools and thought that what Loretta was looking for might be something Idella could make. What Loretta was looking for was a bench, not just any bench, but one for a specific corner of the garden Harold had tended every evening after supper for 40 years. The northeast corner, with the old oak and the forsythia he'd planted the first spring they lived there. The corner where he'd always sat to watch the light change. She wanted it made from something that had lived outside, Loretta said. Something that already had weather in it. Idella found the right stump the following morning, a red oak she'd been holding for 6 weeks moisture at 17% diameter, wide enough for two people to sit comfortably. Root system dried into stable flanges that would anchor the piece without additional work. She spent a long moment with her hand on the surface before she picked up the chainsaw. She worked the bench over 3 days, not because the work required 3 days, but because she refused to rush it. The seat she shaped with the angle grinder through an afternoon, checking the surface with her palm after every pass, reading the grain for the places where it changed direction and required a different approach. The epoxy fills on 2 deep surface checks she poured in 2 separate sessions. The sealer she applied 4 coats instead of 3, adding the 4th because the oak's open grain absorbed more than the cherry had. On the morning of delivery, she rose early and drank her coffee on the back step and looked at the bench sitting in the lean-to in the April light. She thought about Harold Vance, who she had never met, watching the light change in a corner of his garden for 40 years. She thought about rings and wood and what they recorded. She thought about her father and the smell of walnut chocolate and earth when freshly cut something you recognized before the grain confirmed it. She loaded the bench into the truck, carefully patting the finished surfaces with moving blankets, and drove to Heber's Ford on back roads. Loretta was waiting at the garden gate when Idella pulled up, a small woman in her late 60s with white hair and a cardigan she'd clearly put on for the occasion. They carried the bench together to the northeast corner where the old oak stood, and the forsythia was blooming, which Idella hadn't planned, but which was the kind of thing that happened when you showed up at the right time. They set it down. Loretta stepped back and looked at it. Then she crouched slowly, with the care of a woman whose knees had earned their complaints, and ran her hand along the grain of the seat. She traced the epoxy seam in the largest surface check with one finger, followed it the way you follow a scar you know the history of. "It looks like something that had lived a life the same as he had," she said quietly. She didn't sell furniture. She sold proof that hard seasons don't have to end you. Idella drove back to Calder on back roads with the moving blankets folded on the passenger seat. She pulled over near the top of the ridge west of town, where the view opened up the river valley to the east. The Ozark Hills rolling south until the haze took them, the afternoon light doing what April light did in the Ozarks, which resisted description and stayed in the memory. She sat there for 5 minutes, maybe 10, not thinking about what she needed to do when she got back. Not thinking about the moisture log or the sealer coats waiting or the phone calls she still needed to return. The understanding arrived the way certain understandings arrive, not as an insight worked toward, but as a recognition of something that had been true for a while and was only now making itself known. The people who'd responded most strongly to what she was making weren't responding only to the craftsmanship. They were responding to something the wood carried, a quality of having survived, of being genuinely old and genuinely imperfect in ways that couldn't be manufactured. A quality that spoke to something in people who had their own long seasons behind them. Loretta had named it without knowing she was naming it. She drove back to the farm and spent the rest of the afternoon returning phone calls. By June, she had a waiting list for the first time, 6 people spread over 3 months. A waiting list implied a business, and a business implied certain things about how she spent her time and what she charged and how she thought about the field out back. The stumps were not raw material anymore in the way she'd first thought of them. They were something between raw material and subject, something that required reading before it could be worked. The Drummond timber trucks had been coming every Thursday since March of 2013, regular and unhurried. She'd said nothing for 2 years, 11 months, figuring out whether the stumps had value, then a year figuring out how to unlock it. Now she was in the 3rd phase, and the 3rd phase required her to think about supply. She was in the field on a Thursday morning in July of 2015 when Roy Speck's gray Silverado turned in off County Road 14. He wasn't with the delivery crew they'd come and gone an hour before. He was driving alone, a Drummond Timber decal on the rear window, and he pulled up at the field's edge and got out and looked around with the expression of a man doing a private accounting. The small painted sign at the end of the driveway, rustic outdoor decor letters she'd painted herself on a piece of cedar board in April, had apparently registered. He walked to the fence and looked at the bench sitting near the lean-to, a walnut piece just finished and waiting on pickup for a garden center in Fayetteville that had cold called her after seeing Bev Alderman's photographs online. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at that bench. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that changes the math he's been running in his head. The calculation updating behind the eyes before the mouth catches up. 3 minutes he stood there, maybe more. Then he walked back to his truck and drove away without speaking. She watched him go from where she stood at the edge of the field, tape measure in hand, and understood that something had shifted in the way things shifted in the Ozarks. Not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, the way the creek shifts after a flood and never runs exactly the same line again. She went inside, checked the phone on the kitchen counter. 2 missed calls from a number she didn't recognize, area code Harrison, which was where Drummond Timber kept its main office. She set the phone back on the counter. She poured a second cup of coffee. She waited. Roy Speck called on a Friday morning 2 days after he'd stood at the fence on that Thursday, looking at the walnut bench without saying anything. He didn't mention the bench. He didn't mention the years of Thursday deliveries that had been happening without permission on land belonging to someone else. He spoke the way a man speaks when he's decided the most efficient path forward is to act as though the past is a country. Neither party has visited briskly, practically, with the manner of someone proposing a new arrangement rather than acknowledging a trespass that a lawyer in Fayetteville had already told its victim was worth pursuing in court. Drummond Timber needed a place to offload Stumps. They understood the property was now being actively used. Would the owner be interested in a formal arrangement, Stumps sorted by species before delivery payment per load, exclusive use of the backfield for disposal? They could start the following Thursday. Idella listened to all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds, which was long enough for Roy Speck to begin a sentence about flexibility on the payment structure. Then she said, sort by species, walnut and cherry first. He said that would be fine. She said she'd send the terms in writing by Wednesday. She hung up and stood in the kitchen with the phone in her hand, looking out the window at the backfield. The lean-tos, the drying inventory, the moisture-tracking notebooks stacked on the workbench she'd built from lumber salvaged off the collapsed porch roof. 2.5 years. She thought about Vivian Pruitt's conference table, the columns dividing things into before and after, the way certain decisions looked from the outside, like surrender, and felt from the inside, like clarity. The trucks still come, but now they ask. She called Vivian's office that afternoon not to discuss a case, but to ask about standard language for a material supply agreement between a private landowner and a commercial timber operation. Vivian came on the line herself after a short hold, and there was a pause before she spoke that contained, Idella thought, a considerable amount of unspoken commentary about the road not taken. Smart Vivian said finally, harder to undo than a settlement. The agreement went out Wednesday. Drummond Timber countersigned and returned it by Friday. The following Thursday, the trucks came through the gate. The gate Idella had fixed herself in April with hardware from the farm supply in Calder, and Roy Speck's crew unloaded 2 separate stacks in the back corner of the field, walnut on the left, cherry and oak on the right, with a spacing between the piles that suggested someone had thought about it in advance. She walked out to inspect after the trucks left. The walnut was good, 4 stumps, 2 of them, large enough to take her breath. Slightly root systems still intact, grain, visible in the cut faces that showed even at a distance, the density and figure she'd come to associate with the oldest trees on the Drummond tract, trees that had been growing since before anyone currently alive had a claim on the land. She pressed her moisture meter into the largest one, 48%. 2 years, maybe more, before it was ready. She tagged it blue and moved on. Donovan Reese showed up in September. He came the way most things came in the Ozarks, without announcement at a reasonable hour, with a practical question. He'd grown up on the farm 2 properties east of Calhoun's, had spent a summer helping his uncle fell timber before the work dried up and the contract his uncle depended on didn't renew. He was 26 now, honest about what he didn't know, which was most of it. He could run a chainsaw without hurting himself. He didn't know rustic furniture from firewood. didn't know the difference between figured maple and plain sawn oak, didn't know why some stumps sat under cover and others stood in the open. He asked questions that were practical and direct, and he listened to the answers without performing comprehension he didn't have. She told him to come back Monday at 7. The workshop at that point was still the two original lean-tos, plus the third structure she'd built from salvaged greenhouse panels cramped when two people worked simultaneously adequate when they staggered their tasks. She taught Donovan the way Harlan had taught her, one thing at a time, demonstrated rather than explained when demonstration was possible, briefly explained when it wasn't. She showed him how to read moisture content and what the numbers meant for workability. She put a piece of figured maple and a piece of plain maple side by side under the lean-to lights and told him to look at them for 5 minutes and tell her what he saw. She listened to what he said, corrected what needed correcting, confirmed what was right. He was a fast study with the chainsaw, faster than she'd been, partly from his uncle's timber work and partly from the advantage of learning from someone who'd already made the mistakes. By October, he could rough out a planter for him without guidance. By November, he was working benches. His finishes lagged. The angle grinder required a sensitivity, still developing a quality of attention that couldn't be rushed, but it was coming. One afternoon in November, she came out of the house to find him standing back from a bench he'd just completed, the first piece he'd finished from rough stump to sealed surface without her involvement. He was looking at it with an expression she recognized because she'd worn it herself, the particular combination of relief and surprise that came from making something that held together, something that worked when you hadn't been certain it would. She walked over and looked at the bench without saying anything. She nodded once. She went back inside before he saw her smile, because the smile was not about the bench. It was about Harlan, who had stood at a fence line and nodded at her the same way, and about the particular way knowledge moved from one pair of hands to another, not through lecture, but through proximity and practice, and the slow accumulation of correct decisions. She made 2 cups of coffee and brought one out to Donovan and left it on the workbench without comment. They worked through the rest of the afternoon without much conversation, which was its own kind of language. A second hire came in the spring of 2016, a woman named Petra Swall, who'd been doing finished carpentry in Fayetteville and wanted to move back to the county where she'd grown up. She came with a level of finish skill that immediately raised the ceiling on what the operation could produce. The lean-tos were tight with 3 people working, but they managed through that first year by staggering shifts and using the open field in dry weather. And the tightness had its own value. It forced an efficiency of movement and workflow that carried over when there was finally more room. The third hire came in early 2017, a semi-retired cabinet maker named Orrin Duckett, who worked part-time and brought 40 years of joinery knowledge that changed the precision of everything they made. With Orrin came a different standard of what finish meant, and Idella found herself learning again the way she'd learned from Harlan, by watching someone who knew more than she did, and understanding through the watching what she still had to develop. She spent the winter of 2016 planning a permanent workshop. Not large, not expensive, but right, built on the old barn foundation that still showed through the grass-oriented, so the north windows brought in the flat light, best for reading grain. The south side able to open in summer to move air through the drying inventory. She drew the plans herself at the kitchen table on graph paper. She hired a local contractor named Webb Gilman, who'd built 3 other outbuildings in the county, and who looked at her drawings for a long time before saying they were better than what most people brought him. The workshop went up in April of 2017, framed in local oak lumber sourced from a sawmill 40 minutes north-sided with board and batten. She painted herself in 2 coats of a gray-green that settled into the Ozark hillside the way she'd intended. The day it was finished, she walked through it alone before anyone arrived, Donovan, Petra, Orrin, all gone for the evening. The contractor's crew packed up. She ran her hand along the workbench built along the north wall, felt the smoothness of the top. She'd planed herself from a wide walnut board she'd set aside for this specific purpose. The new structure smelled like fresh lumber and sawdust, and the linseed oil she'd used to treat the interior surfaces. It smelled like her father's shop, precisely, unmistakably, in a way that stopped her in the middle of the room. She stood with her hand on the walnut workbench and let that be what it was. Not a grief to manage, not a sentiment to push past, just the fact of it. Her father's smell in a building she designed and built on his land, and the understanding that this was not an ending of something, but a continuation. the way a grain line continues through a piece of wood even when the surface changes. After a while, she went out and locked up and drove into Calder and ate dinner at the diner alone. And the woman behind the counter, who had known Earl Whitaker, asked how things were going out at the farm, and Idella said they were going well, which was the truest thing she'd said out loud in a long time. The landscape architect came in spring of 2018, a woman named Cecily Barr from 2 counties over, who'd built a reputation designing residential outdoor spaces for clients wanting materials that carried what she called honest age. She'd found photographs of Idella's work through a landscape design forum online, called Without Preamble, drove out on a Wednesday with a project brief and a clear sense of what she needed. The brief described 1,200 square feet of common green space in a new residential development outside Rogers, benches, planters, accent, pieces all in mixed hardwoods, all finished for outdoor permanence. It was the largest single commission Idella had received, 41 individual pieces over 7 months. She took it without hesitation, spent one evening with the moisture log and the current inventory to confirm she had the material called Orin the next morning to ask if he'd come on full-time through year's end. The commission moved through the year in the way complex work moved when the foundation under it was solid, not without difficulty, but without the kind of difficulty that came from not knowing what you were doing. There were pieces that required more time than she'd scheduled, grain patterns that revealed themselves mid-work and changed her approach. A delivery sequence that required renegotiation when one of the benches needed an additional sealer coat after she found a surface check she'd missed. She handled each problem as it arrived. That was the difference between this year and the first year, not the absence of problems, but the absence of the particular fear that a problem meant everything was failing. The magazine came in 2019. A regional publication out of Little Rock focused on home and garden in the Mid-South had been following her work through Bev Alderman's photographs for 3 years. A writer named Francis Abbott drove out in March and spent an afternoon in the workshop watching Idella and Donovan work, asking questions more intelligent than most people asked. The piece ran in the May issue, 2 pages, 3 photographs. One of them, a wide shot of the back field with the lean-tos and the drying inventory in the Ozark Hills behind the caption reading Reclaimed, Reimagined. The phone rang for 2 weeks after the issue came out in a way it hadn't rung before. Then Calhoun called on a Tuesday morning in June to say that Harlan Spire had died in his sleep the previous night peacefully at home on Ridgeline Road, which was the way Harlan had lived and was therefore the way it was right that he went. She thanked Calhoun. She hung up. She stood in the kitchen with her hand flat on the yellow and white linoleum worn through to the backing near the stove, her father's linoleum, the record of 40 years of mornings in one spot. She didn't move for a while. She'd seen Harlan twice in 2018, both times at the fence line, in the way he'd always come unannounced, brief a single observation before leaving. The last time was November, cold afternoon, and he'd watched her working a difficult walnut piece with grain that reversed direction 3 times across its width, every tool pass a negotiation. He'd watched longer than usual. When he spoke, he said only that she was reading it right. He walked back to his truck. That was the last thing he ever said to her. She went to the field that evening. Not to work, she left the tools in the workshop, left the notebook on the table. She walked to the place at the fence line where Harlan had always stood, the spot worn slightly into the grass from years of his boots in the same position. And she stood there looking at the field the way he had looked at it from the outside, seeing what it had become. The lean-tos held drying inventory sorted by species and stage. The workshop stood solid at the old barn foundation, its gray-green siding already beginning to silver at the edges, the way properly treated wood silvered in the Ozarks. 4 vehicles usually filled the gravel by 7 in the morning. The back field was managed, tracked, productive. Nothing like the chaotic sprawl of that March morning 6 years ago when she tried to count stumps and given up past 150. She stood at that fence until the light was gone. She came inside. Then she cried, not for long, not loudly, just the necessary amount, the way certain things require their due before you can move forward with them properly honored. The memorial marker took her 3 weeks. She'd been setting aside a walnut stump since the previous winter for something important, without knowing what a habit she'd developed for wood that told her it was waiting for a specific use rather than a general one. The stump was 30 inches across properly dry grain, so even in dents that the angle grinder made a sound on it unlike any other wood, She'd worked a slightly higher note, the tone that came from material resisting in the way quality resisted. She shaped the face, then the base, then spent 4 days on the lettering cut freehand with a narrow chisel rather than a burning tool because Harlan had spent 31 years cutting letters in wood, and she wanted to honor that with the same instrument. Harlan Spire. He taught by showing. He knew when to leave. She set the marker at the fence line on a Saturday morning in August, at the spot where his boots had worn their impression into the grass, and tamped the post into the Ozark clay with a mallet. Calhoun came by that afternoon, older now, moving with the care of a man in his late 70s who had earned the right to move carefully, and stood beside her looking at the marker for a while. Said Harlan would have found it acceptable. From Calhoun, that was the highest available praise. The Resort Commission came in the fall of 2019. Millstone Gap Lodge, 3 hours north in the Missouri Ozarks, 12 lakeside cabins being renovated by new ownership, wanting outdoor furniture consistent with what the project director called the honest character of the landscape. The commission specified 48 pieces: chairs, benches, side tables, larger accent stumps for the common areas near the water. The project director had found Idella through Cecily Barr, who gave the referral without being asked when he described what he was looking for. 6 months of focused production, all 4 people working at capacity, a supplemental delivery arrangement with drum and timber to cover the volume of cherry and walnut beyond what the field currently held. A production schedule written on graph paper and posted on the workshop wall. She ran it the way she'd learned to run everything, one decision at a time, each problem addressed as it arrived, the whole held together by the same discipline that had once gone into moisture-tracking notebooks. The last piece, a wide walnut bench for the main cabin's lakeside porch, was finished on a Thursday in December, sealed and loaded for delivery the following morning. Donovan and Petra and Oren had gone home at 5. The workshop was quiet in the specific way spaces are quiet when the work they were built for has been completed. She should have gone inside. The temperature was dropping. She hadn't eaten since noon. She walked to the back of the workshop instead, to the corner where she kept the things she wasn't ready for. The big walnut stump, the one she'd measured first in that March fog in 2013, 4 feet 3 inches across 72 rings root system that had gripped red Ozark clay like something refusing to be finished, was there. She'd moved it twice over the years. She'd never tagged it. Every time she'd stood in front of it with the moisture meter, she'd press the probes in, read the number, put the meter away without writing anything down. She put her hand on it now in the low workshop light. The surface was cool under her palm, the rings visible, the grain at the base showing the figure she'd seen from the beginning, a curl and depth that hadn't diminished in 6 years of drying, but had, if anything, clarified the wood becoming more itself as it shed what it didn't need. She counted the rings the way she'd counted them the first time, crouching in the fog, in a field she hadn't stood in for 11 years. She got to 72 again. The tree had been growing when her father was a boy, when the Ozark hardwood forests were still continuous, when this land had been her grandfather's, and was not yet anything that would need to be inherited or divided or returned to. 72 years of doing what trees do, recording each season in a ring, not judging the thin years or the fat ones, just adding to the record. She had been 44 years old when she drove down County Road 14 in March of 2013 with a cast iron skillet and a box of books. She was 50 now. She stood with her hand on the walnut, and she didn't think about what she would make from it. For the first time in 6 years, she stood in front of a piece of wood without her mind moving immediately toward what it could become, without the moisture meter, the notebook, the assessment of grain and diameter and readiness. She just stood with it in the quiet workshop, her palm on the 72 rings, the December cold coming through the north wall. What arrived was not happiness exactly, not pride exactly, something that had no clean name, something that came into the body before language could catch it, a settling the way a well-built structure settles into its foundation after the construction is done and the weight is finally resting where it belongs. She hadn't won anything. Winning was the wrong frame entirely. She had become someone who knew how to read what was in front of her and work with it rather than against it. And that was a different kind of arrival than winning, quieter, more permanent, less dependent on anyone else's accounting. She took her hand away from the walnut stump. She stood for a moment in the dark workshop, her eyes adjusting the shapes of the tools and the benches, and the drying inventory resolving slowly out of the dimness, the way grain resolves when you hold a piece of wood to the right light. Then she turned and walked out and locked the door behind her. The following Thursday, the Drummond timber trucks came through the gate at 7:10. Roy Speck's crew running the same route they'd run since long before they had permission to run it. The foreman bipped the horn once as they turned in off County Road 14, not a greeting exactly, more an announcement, the small acknowledgement of a relationship that had renegotiated its terms without anyone making a speech about it. Idella was already in the field with the tape measure when they pulled up to the back corner. The morning was cold and clear, the Ozark Hills to the west still in shadow, the sky above them going from gray to the particular pale blue that came before a good day. The trucks backed in, the hydraulics groaned, the stumps rolled off into the designated area, cherry on the left, walnut on the right, sorted the way they'd been sorted for 4 years now. She let the crew do their work. When the trucks pulled out, she walked the new arrivals the way she'd walked every delivery since the beginning, crouching beside each stump in turn, pressing the moisture meter probes into the cut faces, reading the numbers, opening the notebook to the current log page. A cherry stump with visible figure near the base caught her attention. She pressed her palm to the grain and held it there, reading what was present rather than deciding in advance what she wanted. She tagged it orange, not ready but close. She wrote the entry in the notebook, rose from her crouch, moved to the next one. Behind her, the walnut marker at the fence line caught the early light, the chiseled letters standing in shadow. He knew when to leave and the morning opened up around her. The hills, the field, the workshop with its gray-green siding silvering at the edges, the 60 acres her father had left her, that she had not escaped but had instead learned stump by stump and season by season how to read. Her hand found the tape measure in her jacket pocket. Her fingers closed around it. She knelt beside the next stump and began.